where we discover the forgotten heroes who helped create America. Today, we're learning about a man whose anger burned so hot it set the entire South Carolina backcountry on fire and changed the Revolutionary War forever. A man who went from peaceful miller to the most feared guerrilla fighter in America. A man whose name became known for merciless warfare and whose fighting methods affect military plans for many generations. A man they called the Fighting Gamecock. Picture this. It's May 1780, and the British have just defeated the largest American army in the South at Charleston. Over 5,000 Continental soldiers have surrendered in the war's biggest defeat. The Revolution seems dead in the Carolinas. British forces control every major city. Loyalist militias terrorize the countryside, and most patriots have either surrendered, gone home, or run north to Virginia. The royal governor has returned to Charleston, confident that South Carolina has been permanently returned to British control. But in a small cabin deep in the Santee River wilderness, 50 miles from Charleston, a 50-year-old mill owner named Thomas Sumter stands in the smoking ruins of his property. British raiders, under the command of Master Tarleton, have systematically destroyed everything he spent 20 years building. His grist mill lies in burned ruins, its huge stones cracked by the intense heat. His mansion, where he once entertained Charleston merchants and backcountry planters, is nothing but blackened timbers and ash. His barns have been burned, his livestock killed or driven off, his fields trampled by cavalry horses. His wife Mary and their children have run to safety in North Carolina, joining the thousands of Patriot refugees streaming north ahead of British revenge. His slaves have scattered, some running to British lines where they've been promised freedom, others hiding in the swamps and forests, waiting to see which side will finally control their fate. His fortune accumulated through decades of backbreaking work on the South Carolina frontier has been wiped out in a single day of turns. Systematic destruction. Most men his age facing such complete destruction would have accepted defeat. They would have taken the loyalty oath demanded by British commanders, acknowledged King George's authority, and tried to rebuild what they could under royal rule. After all, Sumter was 50 years old, an age when most men of his time were thinking about retirement rather than revolution. He had grandchildren to consider, a wife who needed protection, and practical concerns about survival in a war-torn colony. Thomas Sumter chose war. But this wasn't a quick decision born of sudden anger. As Sumter looked at the ruins of his life's work, his mind was already calculating, planning, weighing options with the cold precision that had made him one of the most successful businessmen in the South Carolina backcountry. He understood better than most that this moment represented a major turning point, not just in his own life, but in the entire struggle for American independence. The destruction of his property wasn't random violence. It was part of a carefully planned British strategy to break Patriot resistance by targeting its leadership. British intelligence had identified men like Sumter as key figures in maintaining colonial resistance by destroying their economic base and threatening their families. British commanders hoped to force Patriot leaders into submission or flight. What the British failed to understand was that men like Thomas Sumter had been shaped by decades of frontier warfare against Cherokee war parties, outlaw gangs, and the unforgiving wilderness itself. They had learned that survival sometimes required embracing violence so total and ruthless that enemies would think twice before crossing them again. They understood that in the backcountry, a reputation for toughness was often more valuable than gold because it prevented future attacks and commanded respect from allies and enemies alike. Standing in the ruins of his mill, Thomas Sumter made a calculation that would change American history. He realized that conventional military resistance had failed catastrophically. The Continental Army had been crushed. The state government had collapsed, and British forces controlled all the strategic points in South Carolina. But the British had also made a fatal mistake. They had turned their occupation into a war of personal revenge. by systematically attacking the property and families of Patriot leaders. This created an opportunity for a different kind of warfare, one perfectly suited to Sumter's skills and temperament. Instead of trying to defeat British armies in conventional battles, Patriots could wage a campaign of constant harassment, striking British supply lines, disrupting communications, and making the occupation so costly and dangerous that Britain would eventually abandon South Carolina, rather than continue bleeding men and money in an endless guerrilla war. What happened next would transform him from an unknown frontiersman into one of America's most effective military commanders, earning him a nickname that struck fear into the hearts of British officers from Charleston to Camden. His guerrilla campaign would become a masterclass in irregular warfare, studied by military thinkers and special operations forces for generations. But Sumter's path to becoming the Fighting Gamecock began long before the Revolution, in the unforgiving wilderness of colonial Virginia, where violence was a daily reality and survival depended on quick thinking, quicker reflexes, and an absolute refusal to back down from any fight. Born around 1734 in Hanover County, Virginia, Thomas Sumter entered a world that was still largely untamed wilderness. This was the Virginia of the early 18th century, where the line between civilization and savagery was marked by crude log cabins, surrounded by endless forests filled with hostile Indians, dangerous wildlife, and lawless men who recognized no authority beyond the reach of their muskets. Hanover County sat on the very edge of English settlement, a place where European ideas of law and order meant little and practical survival skills meant everything. The Sumter family, like most frontier settlers, lived in constant danger from Cherokee and Catawba war parties who viewed English expansion as a life or death threat to their hunting grounds and way of life. Raids could come without warning, leaving entire families dead and their cabins reduced to smoldering ruins. Thomas Sumter's father, William Sumter, had arrived in Virginia from England sometime in the early 1720s, part of the great wave of immigration that pushed the boundaries of English settlement ever westward. Like most frontier patriarchs, William was simultaneously farmer, hunter, militia, officer, and judge, forced by circumstances to master every skill necessary for survival in a world where the nearest neighbor might be miles away and the nearest government official hundreds of miles distant. The elder Sumter had chosen his land wisely, settling along the South Anna River where the rich soil could support crops and the water provided power for a small mill. But frontier prosperity always came with a price. The better the land, the more likely it was to attract the attention of Indian war parties, rival claimants, or simple bandits who preferred taking what others had built to the hard work of building something themselves. Young, Thomas learned these harsh lessons early. His childhood was spent not in formal schooling, which barely existed on the Virginia frontier, but in the practical education of survival. By age 10, he could shoot accurately with both musket and rifle, track game through dense forests, read weather signs that meant the difference between life and death, and spot the subtle signs of Indian presence that could provide warning of impending attack. But Thomas Sumter's education went beyond simple wilderness survival. His father, despite the demands of frontier life, was a man of some learning who understood that success in America required more than just the ability to fight and farm. William Sumter taught his son to read and write, skills that were uncommon among frontier settlers, but essential for anyone who hoped to rise above subsistence farming. More importantly, William Sumter taught his son the principles of leadership that governed his frontier society in a world where formal government was largely absent. Community leadership fell to men who could command respect through their competence, courage, and fairness. These informal leaders settled disputes, organized defense against Indian attacks, and made the countless decisions that kept frontier communities functioning. Thomas absorbed these lessons well, displaying from an early age the combination of intelligence, physical courage, and natural authority that would later make him one of America's most effective military commanders. His childhood friends remembered him as someone who naturally took charge in any situation, whether organizing hunting expeditions, settling arguments among the local boys, or planning pranks that required careful coordination and timing. But the frontier also taught brutal lessons about the nature of violence and its role in human affairs. This wasn't the romanticized violence of European chivalry tales or the regulated combat of formal military campaigns. This was violence in its rawest form, sudden, merciless, and decisive. Cherokee war parties didn't take prisoners for ransom or observe rules about protecting women and children. They struck without warning, killed everyone they could, and vanished back into the forest before organized resistance could form. Frontier settlers learned to respond in kind. When Indian raids threatened their communities, they organized counter-raids that were every bit as ruthless as the attacks that provoked them. They burned Indian villages, killed warriors and civilians alike, and destroyed crops and supplies with the same systematic thoroughness that their enemies had shown. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculated strategy designed to make the cost of continued warfare so high that enemies would choose to make peace rather than face complete destruction. Thomas Sumter's first direct experience with this kind of warfare came when he was barely 14 years old. A Cherokee war party had struck several isolated cabins along the South Anna River, killing entire families and taking their scalps as trophies. The surviving settlers, including William Sumter, organized a pursuit party to track down the raiders and exact revenge. Young Thomas begged to be included in the expedition, arguing that he was old enough to fight and that his tracking skills would be valuable. His father initially refused, believing his son too young for such dangerous work. But the frontier was a place where boys became men early, and Thomas's persistence eventually wore down his father's resistance. The pursuit lasted 5 days, following a trail that led deep into the Virginia wilderness toward the Cherokee settlements in the western mountains. The settlers moved carefully, knowing that their prey was skilled in woodcraft and likely to set ambushes for unwary pursuers. They traveled mostly at night, covering their tracks and avoiding open areas where they might be spotted from a distance. On the morning of the 6th day, they found the Cherokee war party camped beside a small stream, confident that they had outdistanced any pursuit. The warriors were preparing breakfast, their weapons stacked carelessly nearby, when the Virginia frontiersmen struck without warning. The attack was over in minutes. Half the Cherokee warriors died in the initial volley of musket fire. Tay and the survivors were hunted down and killed as they tried to flee into the forest. No prisoners were taken. No mercy was shown. This was frontier justice in its purest form. Swift, final, and designed to send a message to other potential raiders about the costs of attacking English settlements. For young Thomas Sumter, this experience was both traumatic and formative. He had witnessed violence on a scale that would have shocked most Europeans, but he had also learned lessons that would serve him well in later conflicts. He had seen how surprise and careful preparation could allow a smaller force to defeat a larger one. He had observed the psychological impact of ruthless tactics on enemies who expected to face conventional resistance. Most importantly, he had learned that in frontier warfare, the side that was willing to be more ruthless and persistent usually won. These lessons were reinforced over the following years as Thomas came of age in a Virginia frontier that was constantly threatened by Indian raids, outlaw gangs, and the everyday violence that characterized life beyond the reach of formal law enforcement. By the time he reached his 20s, Thomas Sumter had developed a reputation as someone you definitely didn't want as an enemy and definitely did want as an ally. The death of his father in 1752, when Thomas was 18, forced him to assume responsibility for his family's property and his community's safety. This wasn't unusual on the frontier, where life expectancy was short and young men often found themselves thrust into positions of leadership before they felt ready. But Thomas seemed to thrive under the pressure. displaying the kind of decisive leadership and quick thinking that marked successful frontier commanders. Local stories from this period paint a picture of a young man who was simultaneously respected and feared by his neighbors. He was tall for his era, standing about 6 feet in an age when most men were several inches shorter. His physical presence was commanding, with dark eyes that seemed to bore into anyone who crossed him, and a voice that could be heard clearly across a crowded room or a battlefield. But it wasn't just Thomas's physical attributes that made him formidable. He possessed an intelligence that was both practical and strategic, able to analyze complex situations quickly and develop effective responses. More importantly, he had that rare combination of personal courage and strategic thinking that made him equally effective, whether leading a small patrol through dangerous territory or organizing a large expedition against distant enemies. These qualities were tested repeatedly during the French and Indian War, which began in 1754 and eventually engulfed most of North America. For frontier settlers like Thomas Sumter, this wasn't a distant conflict between European powers, but a desperate struggle for survival against enemies who were literally fighting for their homeland. The French had allied themselves with most of the major Indian tribes, providing them with weapons, supplies, and military advisors who helped coordinate attacks against English settlements. This created a strategic nightmare for frontier communities that found themselves facing not just random raids by individual war parties, but systematic campaigns designed to drive English settlers back beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Thomas Sumter's response was to help organize a network of frontier militia companies that could respond quickly to Indian attacks while also launching preemptive strikes against hostile tribes. This required skills that went far beyond simple military tactics. It demanded an understanding of Indian psychology and culture, intimate knowledge of local geography, and the ability to coordinate operations across vast distances with primitive communications. Sumter proved exceptionally gifted at this kind of warfare. He had learned Cherokee and Catawba languages during his childhood, giving him insights into Indian thinking that most English settlers lacked. His years of hunting in the Virginia wilderness had made him an expert tracker who could follow even the faintest trail through dense forests and across rocky terrain. Most importantly, he had developed the kind of frontier cunning that allowed him to anticipate enemy movements and position his forces for maximum tactical advantage. During one famous expedition in 1758, Sumter led a mixed force of Virginia militia and friendly Cherokee warriors deep into hostile territory to attack a French supply depot that was providing weapons to anti-English tribes. The target was over 100 miles from the nearest English settlement, requiring a march through some of the most dangerous wilderness in North America. Sumter's force traveled for 2 weeks through forests controlled by hostile Indians, moving mostly at night and covering their tracks during the day. They avoided all established trails, which were likely to be watched by enemy scouts, instead following deer paths and stream beds that provided concealment from observation. The French supply depot was located at a river crossing that controlled access to several important trade routes. It was defended by a stockade manned by French soldiers and allied Indians who believed themselves safe from English attack due to their remote location. The garrison had grown careless over time, confident that no English force would dare venture so deep into hostile territory. Sumter's attack came at dawn when the garrison was least alert, and the morning mist provided concealment for his approaching forces. His men had spent the previous night positioning themselves around the stockade, cutting off all escape routes and preparing for a coordinated assault from multiple directions. The battle lasted less than an hour. Sumter's initial attack overwhelmed the outer defenses, and his Cherokee allies quickly scaled the stockade walls, while the French and their Indian supporters were still trying to organize a coherent defense. The depot's entire garrison was either killed or captured, along with a massive quantity of weapons, ammunition, and trade goods that would have supported Indian raids for months. But the real significance of Sumter's victory lay not in the immediate military gains, but in the psychological impact on both allies and enemies. English settlers throughout the Virginia frontier took heart from proof that aggressive leadership could carry the war deep into enemy territory. Meanwhile, French commanders and their Indian allies began to realize that English frontier fighters were more formidable opponents than they had initially believed. Word of Sumter's exploits spread throughout the English colonies, establishing his reputation as one of the most effective frontier commanders of his generation. Military officers who had dismissed frontier militia as undisciplined rabble began to recognize that men like Sumter possessed skills that regular European troops lacked. They understood terrain, weather, and enemy psychology in ways that formal military education couldn't teach. These experiences during the French and Indian War provided Thomas Sumter with a graduate-level education in irregular warfare that would prove invaluable during the Revolution 20 years later. He had learned how small forces of determined fighters could achieve strategic objectives that conventional armies couldn't accomplish. He had seen how psychological warfare could be as important as tactical superiority in defeating enemies. Most importantly, it developed the kind of strategic thinking that allowed him to see connections between local actions and broader political objectives. By his mid-20s, Thomas Sumter had earned a reputation as one of the most formidable men on the Virginia frontier. But he was also intelligent enough to understand that military prowess alone wouldn't secure his future in an expanding America. The frontier was changing rapidly as immigration increased and government authority expanded westward. Men who wanted to prosper in this changing environment needed more than just fighting skills. They needed business sense, political connections, and the kind of social standing that came from accumulated wealth. This realization led Sumter to begin diversifying his activities beyond military affairs. He established a trading post that served settlers throughout the region, buying their surplus crops and selling them manufactured goods from the east. He began speculating in land, using his intimate knowledge of frontier geography to identify parcels that would become valuable as settlement expanded. He also started a small manufacturing operation producing tools and household items that frontier families couldn't make themselves. These business ventures required skills that were very different from military leadership, but equally demanding in their own way. Sumter had to learn accounting, contract negotiation, supply chain management, and the complex credit relationships that connected frontier communities to merchants in Richmond, Philadelphia, and London. He discovered that he possessed a natural talent for business, with the same strategic thinking that made him effective in warfare, translating surprisingly well to commercial activities. Success in business also brought social advancement. By the early 1760s, Sumter had accumulated enough wealth to move beyond the crude log cabin of his childhood, building a substantial frame house that reflected his rising status in frontier society. He began to dress like a gentleman, wore his hair in the fashionable style of the colonial elite, and cultivated the social graces that distinguished successful planters from common farmers. But prosperity also brought new responsibilities and challenges. Sumter's success made him a natural leader in his community, someone who was expected to take the lead in organizing public works, settling disputes, and representing local interests to colonial authorities. These roles required political skills that were different from both military leadership and business management, but equally important for anyone who hoped to exercise real influence in colonial society. The most significant of these new responsibilities came in 1761, when Sumter was appointed to serve as a justice of the peace for his county. This wasn't an honorary position. Frontier justices wielded real power and faced real dangers in maintaining law and order in communities where formal government authority was often weak or distant. Frontier justice was rough justice, shaped by practical necessities rather than legal theories. Justices had to deal with everything from property disputes between neighbors to violent crimes that threatened entire communities. They had to understand not just law, but psychology, local customs, and the complex web of relationships that held frontier communities together. Sumter proved exceptionally effective in this role, earning a reputation for fairness, firmness, and the kind of practical wisdom that frontier communities respected. He understood that maintaining order required more than just the threat of punishment. It demanded the kind of moral authority that came from consistent application of justice and personal integrity that couldn't be questioned. One case that established Sumter's reputation involved a series of horse thefts that had plagued the county for months. Horse theft was among the most serious crimes on the frontier, where horses were essential for transportation, farming, and defense against Indian attacks. The thefts had created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear, with neighbors beginning to distrust each other and some families talking about moving to safer areas. Sumter organized a systematic investigation that combined his military tracking skills with careful legal analysis. He established that the thefts were being carried out by an organized gang rather than opportunistic individuals, and he identified the likely members through patient detective work that involved interviewing witnesses, analyzing physical evidence, and understanding the social dynamics of the local community. The arrest of the horse thieves required military-style planning and execution. Sumter organized a coordinated operation that struck simultaneously at multiple locations, preventing any of the suspects from escaping or warning their accomplices. The operation went off flawlessly, with all the suspected thieves captured and most of the stolen horses recovered. But Sumter's handling of the legal proceedings that followed was equally impressive. He ensured that the accused men received fair trials with proper legal representation and full opportunity to present their defense. When some community members demanded immediate lynching, Sumter stood firm for due process, arguing that frontier communities couldn't maintain civilization. They abandoned legal procedures whenever crimes made them angry. The trials resulted in convictions for all the accused thieves, with sentences that ranged from public whipping to banishment from the county. The sentences were severe enough to deter future crimes, but not so harsh as to appear vindictive. Most importantly, Sumter's handling of the entire affair demonstrated that frontier communities could maintain law and order through legal procedures rather than vigilante violence. This case, and others like it, established Sumter's reputation throughout the region as a man who combined military prowess with legal wisdom and moral integrity. His fellow colonists began to see him as someone who could be trusted with increasingly important responsibilities, from organizing militia companies to representing their interests in the colonial legislature. Marriage in 1767 to Mary Jameson, daughter of a successful Virginia planter, marked another milestone in Sumter's social advancement. Mary brought not just personal companionship, valuable social connections, and a dowry that significantly increased Sumter's financial resources. More importantly, she proved to be an intellectual and emotional partner who understood the demands of frontier leadership and was prepared to support her husband's increasingly prominent role in colonial affairs. Mary Jameson Sumter was remarkable in her own right, possessing the kind of intelligence, strength, and independence that frontier life demanded from women. She had been educated beyond the norm for women of her era, could read and write fluently, and understood mathematics well enough to help manage the family's business interests. She was also skilled in the domestic arts that were essential for frontier survival: food preservation, textile production, herbal medicine, and the countless other skills that enabled families to thrive in isolated communities. But Mary's most important contribution to her husband's career may have been her political intelligence and social skills. She understood instinctively how to build and maintain the network of relationships that were essential for success in colonial society. She corresponded regularly with women throughout the region, maintaining social connections that provided both personal friendship and valuable intelligence about political and economic developments. The early years of Thomas and Mary Sumter's marriage coincided with their decision to relocate from Virginia to South Carolina, a move that would prove crucial for Sumter's later military and political career. The decision to leave Virginia wasn't made lightly. Sumter had established himself as one of the leading figures in his community and was beginning to accumulate the kind of wealth and influence that could have supported a successful political career. But South Carolina offered opportunities that Virginia couldn't match. The colony was growing rapidly, with vast areas of fertile land available at reasonable prices. The colonial government was actively encouraging immigration from other colonies, offering attractive terms for settlers who could bring capital and expertise to develop new regions. Most importantly, South Carolina's political structure was more fluid than Virginia's, offering opportunities for talented newcomers to advance more quickly than would have been possible in the more established social hierarchy of the older colony. Sumter's destination was the high hills of Santee, a region about 50 miles northwest of Charleston that was just beginning to be settled by immigrants from Virginia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. The area offered everything that had attracted Sumter to frontier life: rich soil, abundant water power for mills, and enough distance from established authority to allow ambitious men considerable freedom in managing their affairs. The move to South Carolina required careful planning and substantial financial investment. Sumter had to sell his Virginia properties, transport his family and possessions hundreds of miles over primitive roads, and establish new business relationships in an unfamiliar economic environment. He also had to learn the complex social and political dynamics of a colony that was very different from Virginia in its economic structure, its ethnic composition, and relationship with British authority. South Carolina in the 1760s was a colony in rapid transition. The coastal regions around Charleston had been settled for nearly a century and had developed a sophisticated plantation economy based on rice and indigo production. This coastal elite was among the wealthiest and most culturally refined in British North America, with strong connections to London and a lifestyle that rivaled that of English country gentlemen. But the interior regions, where Sumter planned to settle, was still largely frontier territory, populated by recent immigrants who had little in common with the Charleston aristocracy. These backcountry settlers were predominantly Scots-Irish, German, and English immigrants who had moved south from Pennsylvania and Virginia. Seeking cheap land and economic opportunity, they were typically small farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers who possessed little formal education, but considerable practical skills and strong opinions about their rights and freedoms. The cultural divide between the coastal elite and backcountry settlers created constant political tension in colonial South Carolina. The Charleston merchants and planters controlled the colonial government and used their influence to advance policies that benefited their own interests, maintaining slavery, developing trade relationships with Britain and the Caribbean, and keeping taxes low on property while imposing them on goods consumed by ordinary colonists. Backcountry settlers resented this coastal domination and demanded greater political representation, cater, roads, and courts, and policies that served their interests rather than those of Charleston merchants. These tensions would eventually play an important role in South Carolina's response to British policies that preceded the Revolution. But in the 1760s, they simply represented the normal growing pains of a rapidly expanding colony. Thomas Sumter positioned himself skillfully within these complex political dynamics. He had enough wealth and education to win acceptance from the coastal elite when necessary, but his frontier background and democratic instincts aligned him naturally with backcountry settlers who formed the majority of South Carolina's population. This gave him unusual political flexibility and helped him build coalitions that bridged regional and class divisions. Sumter's first priority in South Carolina was establishing the economic foundation for his family's future prosperity. He purchased several thousand acres along the Santee River, choosing land that combined fertile soil for farming with good water power for industrial development. His most important early investment was a gristmill that served farmers throughout the region. processing their grain into flour and cornmeal that could be sold in Charleston or exported to other colonies. The mill business proved immediately profitable and established Sumter as an important figure in the local economy. Farmers from throughout the region brought their grain to Sumter's mill, providing him with detailed knowledge of agricultural production and economic conditions across a wide area. Mill customers also brought news and gossip, making the mill an informal information center where Sumter could stay informed about political and military developments throughout the colony. Success in the mill business led to expansion into other areas. Sumter began buying land for speculation, using his growing knowledge of the region to identify parcels that would increase in value as settlement expanded. He established a general store that sold manufactured goods to local farmers and bought pills, their surplus crops, for resale in Charleston. He also began lending money to other settlers, earning interest while helping to finance the economic development of the region. These diverse business activities made Sumter one of the wealthiest men in the South Carolina backcountry within a decade of his arrival. But wealth also brought responsibility and prominence that would eventually draw him into the political conflicts that preceded the Revolution. As one of the region's most successful residents, Sumter was naturally looked to for leadership in community affairs, from organizing churches and schools to representing local interests in dealings with colonial authorities. The most important of these early leadership roles was Sumter's appointment to command the local militia company. This wasn't just an honorary position. Militia commanders were responsible for organizing the defense of their communities against Indian raids, outlaw gangs, and other threats to public safety. They had to train civilian soldiers, maintain weapons and equipment, coordinate with other militia units across the region. Sumter's military experience in Virginia made him an obvious choice for militia command, but his success in the role went beyond his technical qualifications. He understood, instinctively, how to motivate civilian soldiers who had families and businesses to worry about and couldn't be expected to show the same discipline as professional troops. He combined military efficiency with democratic leadership, earning his men's respect through competence and fairness rather than harsh discipline. The militia units that Sumter commanded in South Carolina were very different from the Virginia frontier companies he had known in his youth. South Carolina's backcountry settlers came from diverse backgrounds and brought varied military experience to their service. Some were veterans of European wars who understood formal military procedures. Others were former Indian fighters who excelled at irregular warfare. Still others were recent immigrants who had little military experience but strong motivation to defend their new homes. Welding these diverse elements into effective military units required leadership skills that went beyond simple tactical knowledge. Sumter had to understand the cultural backgrounds and personal motivations of his men, adapting his leadership style to work with Scott Seaver's farmers, German artisans, English shopkeepers, and others who brought different expectations about military service and civil authority. The challenge of commanding such diverse forces prepared Sumter for the complex coalition building that would characterize his Revolutionary War leadership. During the Revolution, his forces would include not just South Carolina militia, but Continental Army deserters, escaped slaves, Cherokee warriors, French volunteers, and various other groups with very different motivations and fighting styles. His early experience managing diversity within his peacetime militia units taught him skills that would prove invaluable in war. The period from 1770 to 1775 saw increasing tension between British authorities and American colonists over issues of taxation, trade regulation, and political representation. In South Carolina, these conflicts were complicated by the colony's internal divisions between the coastal elite and backcountry settlers, who often disagreed about how to respond to British policies. To Charleston merchants and planters who controlled South Carolina's government, had complex relationships with British authority. On one hand, they resented British policies that restricted their trade and imposed taxes on their economic activities. On the other hand, they depended on British military protection for maintaining slavery and controlling the large population of enslaved Africans who formed the foundation of their economic system. Backcountry settlers like Sumter had a more straightforward relationship with British authority. They had less to lose from resistance and less to gain from continued connection to Britain. Their economic activities were largely self-sufficient and didn't depend heavily on British markets or British protection. They were also more democratic in their political instincts, more willing to challenge authority they considered illegitimate, and less concerned about maintaining social hierarchies that British rule helped to support. These differences in perspective created opportunities for men like Sumter, who could bridge the gap between coastal and backcountry interests. His wealth and education gave him credibility with Charleston leaders, while his frontier background and democratic sympathies aligned him with backcountry settlers. This positioned him to play an important role in building the coalition that would eventually commit South Carolina to the Revolutionary. Because Sumter's first direct involvement in revolutionary politics came in 1774 when he was elected to represent his district at the Provincial Congress that was organized to coordinate South Carolina's response to the coercive acts passed by Parliament after the Boston Tea Party. The Provincial Congress was an extra-legal body that represented the first step toward independence by establishing American political authority outside the framework of British colonial government. The Provincial Congress brought together men from throughout South Carolina who shared commitment to resisting British policies but disagreed about tactics and ultimate objectives. Coastal delegates generally favored moderate resistance designed to force British concessions without breaking the connection to the empire. Backcountry representatives like Sumter were more willing to consider radical measures, including armed resistance and eventual independence. By his 20s, Sumter had earned a reputation as someone you didn't want to cross. He was tall for his era, standing about 6 feet with piercing eyes and a temper that could explode without warning. Local stories tell of bar fights where Sumter's opponents ended up hospitalized and land disputes where his mere presence was enough to settle arguments in his favor. But Sumter wasn't just a brawler. He possessed a keen intelligence and natural leadership ability that drew people to him. When he spoke, men listened. When he made decisions, others followed. These qualities would serve him well in the deadly game of frontier politics and warfare. In his early 30s, Sumter married Mary Jameson, a woman whose strength matched his own. Together, they embodied the American frontier spirit, tough, independent, and unwilling to bow to any authority they didn't respect. Mary would prove to be far more than just a frontier wife. She would become Sumter's strategic partner, his intelligence network, and his emotional anchor during the darkest days of the war. The young couple initially settled in Virginia, where Sumter worked various jobs, surveying land, operating a country store, and eventually running a mill. But the Virginia frontier was becoming crowded, and opportunities were limited. Like many ambitious Americans of his generation, Sumter looked south to the Carolina backcountry, where land was cheap and a man could carve out his own destiny. Around 1760, the Sumters packed their belongings and headed south to the high hills of Santee in South Carolina. This region between Charleston and the North Carolina border was perfect for Sumter's ambitions. Rivers provided power for mills, the soil was fertile, and the colonial government was distant enough not to interfere with a man's business. Sumter established himself along the Santee River, building a mill and accumulating land. He wasn't just farming and milling grain. He was building an empire. By the early 1770s, Sumter owned thousands of acres, dozens of slaves, and multiple business ventures. He had transformed himself from a poor Virginia boy into one of the most successful men in the South Carolina backcountry. But success didn't soften Thomas Sumter. If anything, prosperity made him more determined to protect what he had built. He served as a justice of the peace and in the colonial militia, gaining experience in both law and military affairs. These weren't ceremonial positions in the backcountry. Justices of the peace settled violent disputes that could erupt into blood feuds, while militia officers led campaigns against Cherokee war parties and lawless gangs. During the Cherokee War of the 1760s, Sumter gained his first real military experience. This wasn't European-style warfare with neat formations and formal rules. This was irregular combat, ambushes, night attacks, burning villages, and showing no quarter to enemies. Sumter learned that in frontier warfare, the side that struck first struck hardest, and showed the most ruthless determination usually won. These lessons in irregular warfare would prove invaluable when Sumter faced the British and their allies 15 years later. But in the early 1770s, war with Britain seemed unlikely. Most South Carolina backcountry settlers, including Sumter, felt little connection to the political disputes brewing in places like Boston and Philadelphia. That began to change as British policies increasingly interfered with backcountry life. The Proclamation of 1763 limited westward expansion. The Stamp Act taxed documents that frontier businesses needed. The Townshend Acts increased the cost of manufactured goods that isolated communities couldn't produce themselves. Each new British policy hit men like Sumter where it hurt, in their pocketbooks and their independence. But what really turned Sumter against British rule wasn't abstract political philosophy. It was personal experience with British arrogance and incompetence, as tensions increased between Britain and the colonies. Royal officials in Charleston began treating successful backcountry men like Sumter as potential threats rather than valuable subjects. When representatives of the Continental Congress visited South Carolina seeking support, they found Sumter already primed for rebellion. He wasn't interested in theories about taxation without representation or natural rights. He cared about practical matters. Would independence give him more freedom to expand his business, protect his property, and live without interference from distant authorities? The answer was clearly yes. By 1775, Thomas Sumter had committed himself to the Patriot cause. But unlike the Charleston elite who dominated South Carolina's revolutionary leadership, Sumter brought a different perspective to the struggle. He understood that this war would be won or lost, not in formal battles between uniformed armies, but in the brutal, irregular fighting that would consume the southern backcountry when the revolution began in earnest. Sumter initially served as a conventional officer in South Carolina's regular forces. He participated in the Siege of 96 and other early campaigns, gaining experience in military logistics and command. But these early operations were relatively tame compared to what was coming. The real war began in 1778 when the British shifted their strategy south, convinced that the southern colonies contained thousands of loyal subjects waiting to be liberated from Patriot oppression. British commanders planned to conquer the South systematically, starting with Georgia and working north. The British strategy initially worked brilliantly. Savannah fell in December 1778. Charleston, the largest city in the South, came under siege in early 1780, when Charleston surrendered on May 12, 1780. With over 5,000 American troops captured, it seemed like British control of South Carolina was complete. But the British made a fatal error. Instead of treating defeated South Carolinians with generosity, they imposed harsh occupation policies designed to crush any remaining resistance. Patriots were forced to swear loyalty oaths or face imprisonment. Property was confiscated from anyone suspected of disloyalty. British and Loyalist forces were given free rein to settle old scores with their Patriot neighbors. These policies enraged men like Thomas Sumter, who had prospered under the relatively loose colonial system and had no intention of submitting to tight British control. When British raiding parties began systematically destroying Patriot property, including Sumter's mill and plantation, they transformed a successful businessman into an implacable enemy. The destruction of Sumter's property wasn't just an economic disaster. It was a personal insult that demanded blood vengeance. In the honor-based culture of the southern frontier, a man who allowed his property to be destroyed and his family threatened without retaliation was no man at all. Mary Sumter and the children fled to safety in North Carolina, while Thomas gathered what remained of his possessions and began planning his revenge. But Sumter was too intelligent to simply strike back randomly. He understood that individual acts of vengeance would only bring more British retaliation down on innocent patriots. What was needed was organized resistance that could inflict real damage on British operations while avoiding decisive battles that would result in American defeat. Sumter's solution was to create a new kind of military force, a guerrilla band that could appear suddenly to strike British targets, then vanish into the swamps and forests before enemy reinforcements arrived. This required men who knew the local terrain intimately, could live off the land for extended periods, and possessed the ruthless determination to keep fighting even when vastly outnumbered. Fortunately for Sumter, the South Carolina backcountry was full of exactly such men. The destruction of Charleston and the harsh British occupation policies had created hundreds of refugees with nothing left to lose. These men were natural guerrilla fighters, tough, independent, familiar with irregular warfare from fighting Indians, and motivated by personal grievances against the British and their loyalist allies. Sumter's first recruits included his own neighbors and employees, men who had known him for years and trusted his leadership. But word spread quickly through the Patriot network that Thomas Sumter was raising a force to fight the British. Soon men were arriving at his hidden camps from across the South Carolina backcountry and beyond. What made Sumter different from other partisan leaders was his systematic approach to guerrilla warfare. While other leaders, like Francis Marion, relied primarily on hit-and-run tactics, Sumter developed a comprehensive strategy for liberating South Carolina from British control. First, he organized his forces along military lines with clear chains of command and specific responsibilities for each unit. Unlike irregular bands that functioned as armed mobs, Sumter's men were disciplined soldiers who followed orders and coordinated their actions. Second, he established a network of spies and informants throughout British-controlled territory. These intelligence sources, many of them women like his wife Mary, provided detailed information about British troop movements, supply shipments, and loyalist activities. This intelligence network allowed Sumter to strike British targets that they were most vulnerable while avoiding enemy forces when they were too strong to attack directly. Third, he created a logistics system that could sustain his forces without relying on fixed bases that the British could locate and destroy. Sumter's men lived off the land, received supplies from sympathetic civilians, and captured weapons and equipment from defeated enemies. This made his forces incredibly mobile and difficult for the British to pin down. Finally, Sumter understood that guerrilla warfare was as much about psychology as tactics. Every successful attack on British forces demonstrated that the occupation could be challenged. Every British atrocity committed in retaliation turned more South Carolinians against the crown. Sumter deliberately provoked British commanders into harsh responses that alienated potential loyalist supporters and drove neutral civilians into the Patriot camp. The effectiveness of Sumter's approach became apparent in his first major operation in July 1780. British forces had established a supply depot at Rocky Mount, a fortified position that controlled important river crossings. Taking this position would require more than a simple raid. It would need a coordinated assault by multiple units. Sumter gathered about 600 men for the attack, including his own followers and detachments from other partisan bands. The assault on Rocky Mount failed to capture the fort, but it achieved something more important. It demonstrated that Patriot forces could still mount major operations despite British control of the colony. More importantly, the attack forced British commander Lord Cornwallis to divert troops from other operations to protect his supply lines. This was exactly what Sumter wanted, to force the British into a defensive posture, where they had to spread their forces thin, trying to protect every possible target. Just 4 days later, Sumter struck again at Hanging Rock, another British supply depot. This time, the attack succeeded completely. Sumter's forces overran the British position, capturing prisoners, weapons, and supplies while inflicting heavy casualties on the defenders. The victory at Hanging Rock established Sumter's reputation throughout the South. Here was proof that the British could be beaten, that their control of South Carolina wasn't absolute. Men flocked to join Sumter's forces, and other partisan bands began coordinating their operations with his. But success brought new challenges. The larger Sumter's forces became, the more difficult they were to conceal and supply. British intelligence networks began reporting on his movements, and enemy forces started hunting specifically for his band. Sumter realized he needed to keep moving constantly, and vary his tactics to avoid being trapped by superior British forces. This led to the development of Sumter's signature tactical approach: rapid concentration of forces for specific attacks, followed by immediate dispersal before the enemy could respond. His men would scatter to their homes or hidden camps after each operation, only to reassemble at predetermined locations for the next strike. This approach frustrated British commanders who were accustomed to fighting conventional European-style wars. They could never bring Sumter's full force to battle because it only existed during specific operations. The rest of the time, his army seemed to vanish into the population, making it impossible to defeat decisively. Sumter's success also stemmed from his understanding of his men's motivations. Unlike Continental Army soldiers who served for patriotic ideals or regular pay, Sumter's followers were fighting for deeply personal reasons: revenge for destroyed property, murdered relatives, or personal humiliation at British hands. Sumter channeled this desire for revenge into military effectiveness by allowing his men to share in the spoils of victory. Captured weapons, horses, and supplies were distributed among the fighters based on their contributions to each operation. This created powerful incentives for aggressive fighting while solving the problem of supplying forces operating far from friendly bases. This system, known as Sumter's Law, was controversial even among patriots. Critics argued that it made Sumter's men little better than bandits interested only in plunder. Sumter defended it as the only practical way to maintain forces in the field when the Continental Congress couldn't provide regular supplies or pay. Whatever its moral implications, Sumter's Law worked. His forces remained motivated and effective throughout the war, while other partisan bands often dissolved when their members drifted away to tend their farms or pursue other opportunities. By late 1780, Thomas Sumter had become the most feared man in British Army intelligence reports. They called him the Fighting Gamecock because of his aggressive tactics and refusal to back down from any fight, no matter how outnumbered his forces might be. The nickname captured something essential about Sumter's character and fighting style. Like the Gamecock's bred for fighting in the colonial South, Sumter was naturally aggressive, incredibly tenacious, and would rather die than surrender. British officers learned to dread reports that Sumter was operating in their area because it meant constant harassment, disrupted supply lines, and heavy casualties among their forces. But Sumter's success also made him a priority target for British retaliation. Lord Cornwallis assigned some of his best officers to hunting down and destroying Sumter's forces. The most dangerous of these was Banastre Tarleton, a feared commander of the British Legion who had earned notoriety for giving no quarter to defeated American forces. The showdown between Sumter and Tarleton came on November 20th, 1780, at a place called Blackstock's Plantation. Sumter had positioned his forces to attack a British supply train when Tarleton arrived with 270 cavalry and infantry, hoping to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, Sumter's intelligence network had warned him of Tarleton's approach. the Fighting Gamecock decided to make a stand rather than retreat, positioning his men in a strong defensive position and waiting for the British attack. The Battle of Blackstock's Plantation became one of the fiercest, small-scale engagements of the entire Revolutionary War. Tarleton's men attacked repeatedly, trying to break Sumter's lines through sheer aggression. But Sumter's forces held firm, inflicting heavy casualties on the British while suffering relatively few losses themselves. During the height of the battle, Sumter was severely wounded by a British musket ball that struck him in the shoulder and chest. As he fell from his horse, his men thought he was dead and began to waver. But even wounded and barely conscious, Sumter continued giving orders and encouraging his troops to hold their positions. The sight of their wounded leader refusing to give up inspired Sumter's men to even greater efforts. They repulsed every British attack and finally forced Tarleton to retreat, leaving behind dozens of casualties and most of his supplies. The victory at Blackstock's Plantation came at a terrible cost for Sumter personally. His wounds were so severe that many observers expected him to die. For months, he lay near death in hidden camps while his wife Mary nursed him back to health. During this period, command of his forces passed to subordinates who lacked his strategic vision and personal magnetism. But Sumter's influence continued even while he was incapacitated. The example of his courage at Blackstock's inspired other partisan leaders throughout the South. Men like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, Kay, and Daniel Morgan adopted similar tactics, creating a network of guerrilla forces that made British control of the southern colonies increasingly untenable. While Sumter recovered from his wounds, the war in the South reached a turning point. British forces under Cornwallis invaded North Carolina, hoping to crush resistance there before returning to complete the conquest of South Carolina. But this strategy backfired when Cornwallis became overextended and was eventually trapped at Yorktown by Washington and Rochambeau by early 1781. Sumter had recovered enough to resume active command of his forces, but the strategic situation had changed dramatically. British forces were increasingly on the defensive, and regular Continental Army units under Nathaniel Greene were operating effectively in the South Carolina backcountry. This created new challenges for Sumter. His guerrilla tactics were perfectly suited for harassing an occupying army, but less effective in the more conventional warfare that characterized the war's final phase. Moreover, cooperation between irregular forces like Sumter's and regular Continental troops required diplomatic skills that didn't come naturally to the Fighting Gamecock. Sumter's difficult personality, which had been an asset in organizing guerrilla resistance, became a liability when dealing with other military leaders. He quarreled frequently with Nathaniel Greene over strategy and resources, insisting that his local knowledge and battle experience entitled him to independent command. These disputes reflected deeper tensions between different visions of American military organization. Greene represented the Continental Army's emphasis on professional discipline and coordination with overall strategic goals. Sumter embodied the frontier tradition of independent leadership and local autonomy. Despite these tensions, Sumter continued to play an important role in the war's final campaigns. His forces participated in the Siege of 96 and other operations that gradually drove British forces back toward the coast. By late 1782, British control of South Carolina was limited to Charleston and its immediate vicinity. When the British finally evacuated Charleston in December 1782, Thomas Sumter could claim a large share of the credit for liberating his home state. His guerrilla campaign had demonstrated that popular resistance could defeat even the world's most powerful military force when that resistance was properly organized and ruthlessly executed. But victory came at enormous personal cost. Sumter's property had been destroyed, his health permanently damaged by his war wounds, and his family scattered by years of conflict. Many of his followers had been killed or wounded in the countless skirmishes and battles that characterized the partisan war. Moreover, the social fabric of the South Carolina backcountry had been torn apart by years of civil war between patriots and loyalists. Neighbors had fought neighbors. Families had been divided. And atrocities had been committed by both sides. The psychological scars from this eternal conflict would last for generations. After the war, Sumter faced the challenge of rebuilding his life and career in peacetime. Unlike military heroes who transitioned smoothly into politics, Sumter found civilian leadership more difficult than military command. His autocratic style and explosive temper, which had been assets in wartime, created problems in the give and take of democratic politics. Nevertheless, Sumter's military reputation earned him election to the South Carolina legislature and later to the U.S. House of Representatives. He supported ratification of the Constitution and generally aligned himself with Federalist policies that favored strong national defense and commercial development. In Congress, Sumter proved to be an effective advocate for veterans' rights and Southern interests, but he never achieved the same prominence in politics that he had enjoyed in military affairs. His speeches were forceful but often tactless, and he lacked the diplomatic skills necessary for building legislative coalitions. Sumter's most significant post-war contribution may have been his role in establishing the institutional memory of the Revolutionary War. Through speeches, interviews, and written accounts, he helped preserve the story of the Southern partisan war for future generations. These efforts were crucial because the partisan war had been overshadowed in popular memory by more famous battles like Saratoga and Yorktown. Without Sumter's advocacy, the contributions of men like Francis Marion, Andrew Pickens, and thousands of nameless guerrilla fighters might have been forgotten entirely. Sumter also worked to ensure that surviving veterans received the pensions and land grants they had been promised. This wasn't just charity. It was a matter of honor for a man who had led these soldiers in battle and felt personally responsible for their welfare. As he aged, Sumter became increasingly interested in his historical legacy. He corresponded with early historians of the Revolution, providing detailed accounts of battles and campaigns that might otherwise have been lost to history. These letters and interviews provide some of the most vivid, first-hand accounts of guerrilla warfare during the Revolution. Sumter's descriptions of his campaigns reveal not just military tactics, but the psychological and social dynamics of irregular warfare. He wrote about the constant stress of being hunted by enemy forces, the difficulty of maintaining discipline among men motivated primarily by revenge, and the moral ambiguity of a conflict that often resembled banditry as much as warfare. These accounts also reveal Sumter's own evolution from a successful businessman seeking to protect his property into a revolutionary leader committed to American independence. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. It required years of conflict and personal sacrifice that changed him fundamentally as a person. By the 1820s, Thomas Sumter had become a living symbol of the revolutionary generation. As one of the last surviving general officers from the war, he was frequently called upon to participate in patriotic celebrations and historical commemorations. These appearances allowed Sumter to share his memories with younger Americans who had no direct experience of the Revolution. His speeches emphasized the sacrifices made by ordinary soldiers and civilians, countering historical narratives that focused primarily on famous leaders in major battles. Sumter was particularly concerned that the Southern theater of the war received proper recognition. He argued that the guerrilla campaigns in South Carolina and Georgia had been just as crucial to American victory as more famous Northern battles. This wasn't just regional pride. It reflected Sumter's understanding that the Revolution had been won through popular resistance as much as formal military operations. The willingness of ordinary Americans to fight and die for independence, even when the cause seemed hopeless, had been the key to ultimate victory. Thomas Sumter died on June 1, 1832, at the extraordinary age of 98. He was the last surviving general officer of the Revolutionary War, a final link to the generation that had created American independence. through their blood and sacrifice. His death marked the end of an era in American history. With Sumter's passing, the Revolutionary War moved from living memory into history, preserved only in documents, monuments, and the stories passed down through families. But Sumter's legacy extended far beyond his personal story. His guerrilla campaigns had established principles of irregular warfare that would influence American military thinking for generations. During the Civil War, Confederate leaders studied Sumter's tactics when organizing resistance to Union occupation. In the 20th century, American Special Operations Forces drew inspiration from Revolutionary War partisans like Sumter when developing counterinsurgency techniques. More broadly, Sumter's story illustrates the complex relationship between violence and democracy in American history. His willingness to use extreme measures in defense of liberty helped secure American independence. But it also established precedents for extra-legal violence that would complicate American society for centuries. The Fighting Gamecock's legacy also highlights the importance of local leadership in American history. While national figures like Washington and Jefferson rightfully received the most attention, the Revolution was ultimately won by men like Sumter who organized resistance at the grassroots level. These local leaders understood their community's specific needs and grievances in ways that distant commanders could not. They provided the human connections between abstract political ideas and concrete military action, transforming philosophical concepts about liberty into practical programs for armed resistance. Sumter's story also reveals the personal cost of revolutionary leadership. His commitment to the cause required sacrifices that affected every aspect of his life: his health, his family relationships, his economic security, and his psychological well-being. Yet, despite these costs, Sumter never expressed regret about his decision to take up arms against British rule. He understood that freedom always requires sacrifice, and he was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to secure American independence. This willingness to sacrifice personal interests for larger principles distinguished the revolutionary generation from both their predecessors and successors. Men like Sumter possessed a sense of historical mission that enabled them to endure hardships that might have broken lesser individuals. The Fighting Gamecock's legacy ultimately rests on his demonstration that ordinary Americans could defeat professional armies through determination, intelligence, and ruthless execution of effective tactics. His guerrilla campaigns proved that popular resistance, properly organized and led, could overcome even the most powerful military forces. This lesson resonated throughout American history, inspiring later generations of Americans who faced seemingly impossible odds, from Civil War partisans to World War II resistance fighters to modern special operations forces. American warriors have drawn inspiration from Thomas Sumter's example, but perhaps Sumter's most important legacy lies in his embodiment of the American frontier spirit, the belief that individuals have the right and responsibility to resist tyranny through whatever means necessary. This spirit, forged in the colonial backcountry and tempered in the fires of revolution, became a defining characteristic of American national identity. Thomas Sumter's transformation from peaceful miller to the Fighting Gamecock represents the broader transformation of British colonists into American citizens. Like the nation itself, Sumter was forged in conflict, shaped by adversity, and defined by his refusal to submit to authority he didn't respect. His story reminds us that American independence wasn't inevitable or easily won. It required individuals willing to risk everything for principles they held sacred, even when victory seemed impossible and the costs were almost unbearable. That's the story of Thomas Sumter, the Fighting Gamecock. His rage lit the fires of revolution across the South Carolina backcountry and helped secure the independence we enjoy today. His legacy lives on, not just in history books, but in the American spirit of resistance to tyranny and commitment to liberty that he helped establish over 2.5 centuries ago. Thanks for watching History USA. If you enjoyed learning about Thomas Sumter and want to discover more forgotten heroes who shaped America, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. In our next episode, we'll explore another Revolutionary War figure whose incredible story has been lost to time. Until then, keep exploring the hidden corners of American history, and remember that the past is never truly past when we keep these stories alive.